Today's topic is empathy. If you love me, know my hurt. So as I've had occasion to mention over the past 5 sessions that I've had the privilege of learning together with you, this series of lectures is based on my upcoming book. And as I've mentioned before, the book is based on a 5-step framework. That framework is represented by the acronym PEACE, P-E-A-C-E. And we had the occasion to discuss positive thinking, the P, E for embracing and reframing the challenging moments of life, A for appreciation, which means gratitude. And yesterday we discussed certainty, both internal certainty and certainty in God's providence. And today our focus is going to be on the E of the PEACE system, the PEACE framework. And the E stands for empathy. Empathy is how we receive by giving. And as you know, if you've attended any of the previous sessions, my book is called Stress Less, Prosper More. And it's a book about conquering financial anxiety. And when we are anxious, we're very internal. It's a very internal energy. We're inside ourselves. And when we reach out to help somebody else, when we give of our resources, of our energy, of our time to other people, the act of giving gets us out of our head. And so there's a great value in that in terms of addressing a person's anxiety that they're feeling. So as counterintuitive as it is, you say, I'm suffering from anxiety, but if I reach out and I help somebody else, then I can actually minimize my own worries and concerns. We'll speak more about that in a moment. So I'll start with a story that the famous Rabbi Yitzchak of Berditchev said. And Rabbi Yitzchak of Berditchev was renowned for how he constantly and unconditionally saw the good and the positive in every person. He was known for his extraordinary love and defense of his fellow Jew. It all started, according to Rabbi Yitzchak, from an incident that he himself observed. And that incident really set him on his life path of being that tremendous advocate for the Jewish people. The story was that there were 2 drunks in the shtetl. And these drunkards, they were lying in a gutter. And they were having a deep, deep philosophical discussion. And they were well-oiled at the time. As I had a friend who used to say, well-oiled. They were well-oiled at the time. Means they were highly inebriated. Translated to Strian. And they were sitting there, and the one turns to the other. And he says, Ivan, do you love me? And Ivan says, yeah, I love you, Igor. So he says, do you really love me? He says, yeah, I really love you. So they just sit in that moment of brotherly love. And then Ivan says, do you sure really love me? He says, yeah, I really love you. Yeah. Then tell me, how should I know what's hurting you? And you don't love me. If you loved me, you would understand, you would feel my pain. That is a precondition of love. You'll know what I'm lacking. You'll do everything in your power to bring solace and comfort and healing to me if you really loved me. And Rabbi Levi Yitzchak happened to hear that. And in his mind, he was like, wow, if you truly love somebody, you've got to know where they hurt it. You've got to. If you don't understand them at that level, if you don't love a person so entirely that you know their good points, that's the parts that are easy to love, but also the parts that are difficult to love, and you don't include that in your love, then it's not a complete love. And so for the rest of his life, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Abadichev devoted his life to ensuring that he understood where people were. Dr. Sarah. And Dr. Conrath, she did a study, she did the study on empathy, since our topic today is empathy, and she interviewed hundreds of college students, and the findings were terrible. The headlines in the newspapers said, in 2009 there were still newspapers, the headline said that we have lost our empathy. The young people of today, the people who are in college campuses, are 40% less empathetic than they were in the 1970s. So they gave a number of reasons, which all seem to make sense. Media, technology, parenting styles changing, people are busier, people have more distractions, there's more pressure to succeed. All of these things, they posited, were making the world less empathetic. But then in 2024, she did this study again. Same team. They did the study again. And they found that the empathy levels amongst college-age students in the United States had returned back to the levels that they were in the 1970s. And I think this is fantastic news. I think that what this teaches us is that empathy is not rigid. So if we look at a generation and we think that generation is entitled, and we think that generation is not empathetic and they don't care about other people, they're selfish and they're only inward focused, wait a generation. It's not rigid. It can change. What's that? Like Melbourne weather, yes. Empathy is a lot like Melbourne weather in that. So this follower, this chassid of the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad movement, comes to the Alter Rebbe, and he has this terrible complaint. What is the complaint? He was a wealthy businessman, and he was a big philanthropist. And he supported his family, he supported many poor families that weren't his family. And something had gone wrong. He'd lost his golden touch in business. And one after another, he was losing money on business deals until he was totally destitute. He no longer could support his family. He no longer was able to remain in his home. And things were going from bad to worse. And so he comes with kind of, I think, a legitimate question and query to his spiritual mentor, the Alter Rebbe. And he comes to the Alter Rebbe and he says, I need to get back my mojo. I need to be that successful businessman that I was before. And the Alter Rebbe tells him, you speak about everything that you need, but you say nothing of what you are needed for. And the guy was shocked. He realized that through his troubles, he was becoming more and more selfishly focused, inwardly focused, more egocentric, and therefore, and he was caring less about the world out there because he was so internalized in his sorrows, in his discomfort. And the Alter Rebbe's statement to him was very shocking. It said, okay, you're all about how can things improve for me? What's in it for me? But what about what you are needed for and what you can give to other people, this empathy. So the person really turned around. He was an elderly man, but he turned around his life at that point in time, and he became much more outwardly focused. And by becoming outwardly focused, things started improving financially. He got his business mojo back again, and he made a few good deals, and he brought himself back into abundance. And it was that harshness of the Alter Rebbe's statement, it was that shocking him into stop being so inward focused and start looking outside, that changed him and ultimately changed his fortune as well. And so in this journey that we've been on over the past 6 days, the past 6 sessions at least, in this journey we've had a lot of opportunity to discuss bitachon, absolute trust in Hashem, and how this opens the channels of blessings to flow into our lives. But giving, as counterintuitive as it is one of the most powerful ways to open up those channels of blessings and let them flow inside. When a child is born, just for those who are following my AI commentary, sub-commentary on all my classes, I'll tell you that this is the hardest thing AI would not depict an infant's child hand, would not generate that. So I don't know why, but it really had a tough time. In general, it's always had a tough time with hands, but this was like impossible. I had to trick it. It kept saying, I cannot do it. You're violating my policies. It was having a nervous breakdown. Anyway, but I finally tricked it into coming up with what I wanted it to depict was an infant child just born. And when infants are born, they come into the world, their hands are clenched. And it's very interesting. I'm sure you've all noticed this. If you go to a child and a young infant, and you put your finger next to their hand will instinctively grab on your finger. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. What's that? A grasp reflex. Grasp reflex. So this reflex to grasp at things when a child is born is because when a child comes into this world, it wants to grab everything. When we are born into this world, we're born with ambition, and we want to acquire things, we want to grab things. When a person passes away, if you've ever seen a person pass away, and again, I'm sorry for this, for this depiction. Oh, it's not bad, actually. Again, it struggled. The AI struggled with this. But when a person passes away, their hands naturally open. And that represents that at the end of life, we realize that we cannot take it with us. The only things we really take with us are that which we have given to others. That, the spiritual energy that's generated when we give to other people, that helps us in our final journey as well. There was a very great rabbi who lived in a place called Piaszczna in Poland. And he was the Piaszczna Rebbe, he was called, and he was famous for how he would educate children. So he had thousands and thousands of children that went through his school, and he educated them with tremendous, he was a very ahead of his time educator, and he educated children and he devoted his entire life to that. He was taken to the concentration camps. First, he was in the Warsaw Ghetto. He actually wrote a book in the Warsaw Ghetto, which is one of the most inspiring, amazing books ever written, Eish Kodesh, it's called. He buried it, and it was found after the war, but he himself perished in the war. So one of his students, one of his many hundreds of students, was a street sweeper on the streets of Tel Aviv. That was his job. He was a street sweeper. Nothing wrong with that. but he was also his body, because he had suffered in the Holocaust, this gentleman's body was quite mangled. AI was not going to give me a Holocaust person under any circumstance. The minute you mention Auschwitz, Holocaust, anything like that, you violated their policy. So he didn't look as, what's that? It's, so he was hunchbacked. His face had been beaten many times. He wore those scars on his face. And he was a street sweeper in Tel Aviv. But if you would stop him, and you'd have a conversation with him, he would tell you something really interesting. He would tell you that he remembers a party that he had with the principal, the dean of his school, and he remembers that it was very freilich, it was very lively, people were dancing, and the Piaseczna Rebbe was getting everybody to dance and sing, all the kids were dancing, and when he'd whipped them up into a real frenzy, he called out and he said, Kinderlach, Kinderlach, Gedenkje, you have to remember, children, remember, die größte Sach in der Welt ist zu tun emetza teuva. The greatest thing in the world is to do somebody else a favor. And he was the street sweeper in Tel Aviv at the time when he heard that statement from his mentor. He was a young child, but he remembered it. And he would tell you that when he went to Auschwitz, and there were days when he thought, this is what he said, there were days when he thought that he could not go on. The suffering was too unbearable. And so he wanted to end his life. And unfortunately, Nebuch, there were many, many who did. And he wanted to end his life. And every time he had that feeling, that urge to end his life, to bring his life to an end and to stop the misery that he was experiencing in the camps, he remembered what his mentor had said. His mentor had said, remember, the greatest thing in the world is to do someone else a favor. And there are a lot of favors you can do in Auschwitz. He went around, people would be calling out in pain and in anguish, and nobody would have the strength to listen to somebody else's pain. But his life was over. He wanted to end his life. So he said, at least, the very least I could do is I could go and listen and bring some comfort to somebody else. And he went from person to person. And he said, what is your pain? Remember, I love you. And to love somebody is to be there with them and witness their pain. And they would tell him what was bothering them most at that particular moment of time. And two things happened. First of all, the person felt better, that they got off their chest the thing that was most bothersome to them at that moment. And second of all thoughts of committing suicide flew out of his head because he was helping somebody else. And that's the primary thesis that I want to say here. Obviously, we don't live in such extreme circumstances, but when we reach out to somebody else, we help ourselves just as much. So the street sweeper on Rehov Yarkon in Tel Aviv would tell anybody who stopped and asked his story, would tell them that there's a lot of toivas, there's a lot of favors that you could do for somebody in Auschwitz. And there's a lot of favors that you could do for somebody in the streets of Tel Aviv. And there's lots of favors that you could do for somebody in your office, in your community, in your homes, where you could reach out to somebody else, you could find somebody who is in need and reach out to that person, bring comfort to that person, bring solace to that person, and in the same time, be helping yourself. There are a lot of benefits to empathy. Empathy creates what they call a biological helper's high. When a person practices empathy, does a favor for somebody else, gives money, their body releases serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, and other chemicals which improve a person's mood and overall health. So literally, it's like having a high. except it's healthy. And it's encouraged. There are other health benefits. It's linked, people who serve others, they live longer lives, they have lower blood pressure, they reduce this cortisol, their stress hormones. So it is comparable. Scientists tell us that it's comparable if you help somebody else to doing exercise and eating a healthy diet. And it's a lot more pleasurable than eating a healthy diet and doing exercise. So there you go. You should all eat healthy and do exercise, by the way. I'm just... and be charitable and empathetic and help other people. And the combination of all of it really is very healthy. As I said before, it shifts your focus outward. So it moves your attention away from being your worries, and it gives you a sense of agency. It gives you a sense of, as you can help somebody else, you feel that you're part of something beyond yourself, that's bigger than yourself. And this is why it supports your well-being and nurtures your resilience and all these things that we've been discussing. Now, in my book, I discuss the difference between empathy and sympathy. So does anyone know what the difference between empathy and sympathy is? What's that? Ah, very good, exactly. So what he said is like this. Imagine, I think this is what he intended to say. I'm going to say it a little bit longer than he said it. Imagine that you see a person carrying a burden, carrying something on their shoulders, and it's very heavy, and they are sweating, and it's difficult, and you can see the pain. It's racking the person's face, right? And they're carrying it. And you go, that must feel really bad. I can really feel, I witness your pain. Were you closer to your mother or your father? That's sympathy. Empathy is you go and you take the peckle and you put it onto your shoulder and you help him carry. You help him carry the burden down the road. That's the difference between empathy and sympathy. So it's interesting. I'd just written this chapter, and a friend of mine, we try every single month to have lunch together and compare notes and where we're up to. So we go out for lunch, and I've just finished writing this article. And my friend tells me that his father is somewhat narcissistic, not somewhat, is quite narcissistic, and he's chased away everybody in his life. So he has all his family, his siblings, and have all been chased away. My friend's an only child, but his uncles and aunts have nothing to do with their father, and any friends he's chased away. He's just been a very toxic influence, and he's chased everybody away. So we got into a fascinating discussion about sympathy and empathy, because I'd just written the chapter on it, and I'm like going, I was just writing something, and I wonder if this applies. Because he wants to be a good son to his father. He's an extraordinary person. And he wants to be a good son to his father, but he wants to protect his own family, his wife and his children from that toxicity that's coming from his father. So we started speaking about empathy and sympathy. And so I'll just say parenthetically that although I am definitely promoting empathy in this class, that's the title of the class, there is a place to have sympathy rather than empathy. So sometimes a person is just so toxic that the best way to relate to that person is to keep a distance from the person. So I'm just saying that parenthetically, but in general, the way that human beings are designed and the way that God wants us to behave is to be empathetic towards each other. But I just want to say that there are times when maybe sympathy is the more appropriate response. Okay, this is a fascinating study. I read this study, I'm like, wow, this is so cool. It's cool because it tells me the same thing that Dr. Conrath discovered, and that is empathy is flexible, even in a person. So you could be a person who's really not by nature empathetic, that you don't really care about other people, and you don't understand how your personality impacts other people. So you can, the good news is you can change. It's not fixed. And this experiment is a really powerful experiment that proves this. So this Dr. Grit Hain, she's a researcher, pioneering neuroscientist actually, in Sweden, and she did the following really, really interesting study. Listen to this. This is wild. So apparently in Switzerland, you have the Swiss, and then there's a whole bunch of people that immigrated to Switzerland from the Balkans. And the Swiss hate the Balkans, and the Balkans return the favor. They hate the Swiss. So there's a lot of tension between those two parties. So she got a whole bunch of Swiss men and a whole bunch of Balkan men into her study. And you can imagine that the Swiss and the Balkan men, they don't like each other. So what did she do? She got these actors, and she filmed these actors getting electric shocks. So they wired up these actors, and they said that it was an electric shock, and they pressed the button, and the guy got a painful, painful shock. So they told the Swiss, that they showed them some video footage of people getting electric shocks. And while they did that, they wired up the brains of the Swiss observers, and they looked specifically at the part of their brain that deals with empathy. So there's a part of your brain that lights up. It's towards the back of your brain. It lights up when you feel empathy, right? So they're monitoring that part of her brain, of the people's brain. So they put an actor there, and they say, it's a Balkan. They say that to a Swiss guy, right? And they shock him. And nothing lights up in the empathy part of the Swiss brain, right? They're not in any way moved at the pain and suffering of their fellow human being. Then they show them another video, and this time they tell them it's a Swiss person who's getting shocked, and their brain lights up. The empathy part of their brain lights up. So in other words, they are empathizing with those that they see as their own tribe, and not with the other, those that they see as the other. So I don't think, excuse the pun, I don't think I shocked anybody with that. I mean, there's huge, racial discrimination between these two parties. And therefore, there's no, so obviously they're not too disturbed when somebody who's in the other group that they don't like gets, shocked. Then what she does, and by the way, the Balkans as well, you put a Balkan there and show him a Swiss guy getting shocked, and he's as unimpressed, right? But that was not what the study was all about. The next stage is what the study is all about. Now it becomes really fascinating. What they do is they turn the tables and they say, okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to shock you, Mr. Swiss man. We're going to give you an electric shock. And you're going to get the electric shock unless somebody in the study gives up some of their money to protect you from that they're going to get. So each person was paid for their participation. They would have to give up some of the money that they were getting paid in order to protect you so that you don't get shocked, okay? And they tell a Swiss person that it was a Balkan who gave up his money, and therefore you avoided getting shocked yourself. One time. Then they wired up their brain, they showed them a Balkan getting shocked, and this time there was empathy. So how long does it take to get rid of prejudice? One act of kindness. One act of kindness that they thought that a Balkan had paid money so that they should not receive a shock themselves, an uncomfortable shock themselves, and that was enough to rewire their brain that they now felt empathy when a Balkan person was being shocked. Yes?
I wonder if that was like you.
Like you're saying Jews and Palestinians, let's say.
No, Jews and anti-Semites will we're so close. We did an act of kindness to an anti-Semite.
Yeah.
Would you rewind their brain?
I don't know. We can do the study. Let's do the study. Let's commission it. I'll tell you one thing. I can tell you that there was once when I was a member of the Rabbinic Council of Montreal, when I was a practicing rabbi in Montreal. So for a short time, Jewish interests and Muslim interests aligned on two topics. The one topic was that there was a credible threat to the based in Montreal having the power and ability to oversee Jewish marriages and divorces. And the Sharia law, the Muslims, they also oversee marriages and divorces and other things within the Muslim community. So there was a coming together of rabbis and imams to try and work together to stop this change in the law, which wouldn't allow these things to take place, God forbid, outside of the regular secular family law courts. And I was on a working group of the rabbis that met with some imams, and we started pooling resources and things together, contexts that we knew that we could lobby in government, and there was different things that we did. And thank God it was averted. I think if I remember correctly, that shortly there was an election, and the whole thing disappeared. But it's interesting because when you're forced into a room for an afternoon with somebody who you perceive as the other, so for the imams, we were definitely the other, and for us, the imams were the other. By the end of the day, there was a certain camaraderie, and there was some follow-up meetings and correspondence. And I do think I can just speak for myself. I don't know what was the feeling on that side of the table. But on my side of the table, I felt that there was definitely a shift in my prejudices to a degree, at least for the people that were in the room there. The other thing that I'm thinking of as I'm talking is a clandestine, very interesting competition that the Rebbe sponsored and the Rebbe instigated in Eretz Yisrael. So I have a friend who was involved in this whole thing, and he told me the story, and it's not a well-known story, it's not out there, but there was a time, I'm not sure if it was in the 80s perhaps, maybe the 70s, and the Rebbe instigated a competition where Muslim people, it was to get Muslim students in school to write about Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach and to write about the sanctity of human life. And the Rebbe put it, and many, many hundreds of students, Muslim students, submitted essays in Arabic on the topic of the sanctity of life and not stealing and all of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. And there was in those days, a $10,000 US dollar first prize for the best essay on the subject, and the Rebbe was the one who sponsored it. But the Rebbe did not want his name or anything associated with it. It would be totally like as if it came from within the Muslim community. And I think, obviously we don't know what the Rebbe is thinking, but you see that the Rebbe felt that it was of significant value to get those children, those Muslim children, to write about Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, and just the act of being involved in that competition, I'm sure would have had a very powerful impact on the people that wrote those essays. And I'm sure that had the competition gone the way the Rebbe had hoped, it didn't eventuate to the degree and the scale that the Rebbe had hoped it be, but one can imagine that it could have had a tremendously positive impact on the Muslim community. So I think prejudice is a very superficial thing, and I think Dr. Haynes' Dr. Haynes' research has proven this out, that it's actually not as difficult as we imagine to switch around these prejudices and to develop empathy. And the truth is, to come back to the Rebbe again for a moment, the Rebbe says that encourages us to put a few coins in a tzedakah pushka on a regular basis. Doesn't matter who you are, man, woman, child. You should constantly have a practice, a habit of putting money in a pushka. And in Hasidus, this is addressed in many places. Obviously, you're not going to solve world hunger by putting 50 cents in a pushka. That's nobody, the real impact that 50 cents put in a pushka will have on the world is probably not so great. But I'll tell you where it does have impact. It has impact on your psychology. It has impact on the compassion and the kindness that you have within yourself. So if you are constantly in your office, in your car, in your kitchen, all places the Rebbe said you should put a pushka, a charity box. If you have a charity box in all these places, and every time you go into your kitchen, it's a trigger that reminds you to put a few coins in tzedakah, or when you come to your office to do the same thing, when you get into your car. If that's really what it's doing, is it's rewiring your brain, amongst all the other spiritual things that it's accomplishing. But I'm saying just very physically, in a very tangible way, it's making you a more compassionate person. It's making you more empathetic. So the Rebbe also says that we mistranslate the word tzedakah, and I think I mentioned this in a previous session. We mistranslate the word tzedakah. We translate tzedakah as being as the word charity. But the reality is that charity implies that you are giving of your own resources to somebody else, even though they did nothing to deserve those resources. It's coming purely from your own largesse, from your own good heart. But the real word tzedakah comes from the word tzedek, which means justice or righteousness, which means it is the just, moral, correct thing to do, because that money was given to you. Look, God didn't make people billionaires so that they could spend $450,000 on a ticket to space with Virgin Galactic. That is not why God gave tremendous money to very wealthy people. He gave money to very wealthy people because they are supposed to distribute that money to others. And that's what tzedakah is. Empathy, so I've been speaking about empathy and the benefits that it has for a person, but really that's not why we give charity. That's not why we have to devote our energy and resources to helping other people. The reason we devote our energy and resources to helping other people is because it is the right thing to do. That is why God gave us that energy, those resources in the first place, so that we should distribute it. And when we are distributing, we are fulfilling what God wants from us. The Talmud has this very powerful statement. So I have it written up on the slide there, but I didn't have the advantage of a slide presentation. When one day my mentor at Mendel Futterfass called me over, and for some reason, which I cannot fathom, because he was a really good judge of character, Reb Mendel thought I was learned in Torah. But I don't know, that was the one mistake he made. But so he asked me, he said, where does it say in the Talmud that when you are sick yourself, that does not discharge your obligation to go and visit somebody else who's sick? So I said, I don't know. Where does it say in the Talmud that if you're sick yourself, you still have to go and visit somebody else? You still have the obligation to visit somebody else who is not feeling well themselves. So while I was pondering where it could possibly say this in the Talmud, Reb Mendel, that was Reb Mendel's way of saying that he wanted to go and visit this Jew. I think his name was Reb David Feldman, but they're writing a book about Reb Mendel, and they interviewed me for 4 hours on this book. And I told them, I think the person's name was Reb David Feldman, but they're actually going to confirm that. So they're going to look around and find out, because I'm not 100% sure of the name. But let's just call him Reb David Feldman for the sake of the story. So Reb Mendel says, I want to go to visit Reb David. So Reb Mendel had trouble with his feet, so he would grab on my hand. He had very strong grip. He had iron grip. He was so strong in his hands, so it would really hurt. But it was my pleasure, and we would, and I would be his feet basically. So he would like hang on to me, and off we would go to visit Reb David Feldman. So we come to this man's house. He lives in Kfar Chabad, and we come to his home. And on the way there, Reb Mendel was talking about him. And Reb Mendel had a lot of respect for this person. He said, I must tell you that this person, he spent 13 years in Siberia, and he never allowed one morsel of non-kosher food to pass his lips in 13 years. That means on Pesach, there wasn't a drop of chametz that he ate. And during the year, there was never any unkosher meat, anything unkosher that passed his lips. And Reb Mendel was pretty impressed that a man alone, he was alone, nobody was there, and yet for 13 years, year in, year out, day in, day out, he did not allow any non-kosher food to pass his lips. So Reb Mendel was pretty impressed by this Reb David Feldman. And then we went and we sat at the dining room table of his daughter, where he lived with his daughter, and he was in the advanced stages of dementia or Alzheimer's. Advanced stages. And what had happened was, when people are in that stage or phase of this terrible disease, they forget that they're hungry. Their memory is so bad that they literally forget that they're hungry, and so they stop eating. And that's a lot of people pass away from starvation just because they keep forgetting. They feel hungry, but then they forget that they're hungry. So Reb Mendel sat down next to this Reb David Feldman. And he said to the Reb David, it was actually quite humorous, he said, "Ihr gedenks Neville, do you remember when we were children in Neville?" Neville was a city, a very famous Hasidic city, because it had a lot of very great Hasidim were born in Neville, and it produced a tremendous amount of Chabad Hasidim came from Neville, some of the great Hasidim. And there weren't many opponents to Hasidus in there. In fact, I believe there was one non-Lubavitch shul in Neville, and they never got a minyan. They had to keep bringing Lubavitchers in to get a minyan. So they didn't know, there was no antagonism, there were no what they called misnagdim in Neville. So Reb Mendel said, "The gedenks Neville, you remember when we were in Neville?" So this Reb David, he goes, "Oh yeah, dacht sich mir, I think it was es is given full misnagdim, dacht sich mir. I think it was full of antagonists, opponents to Chabad." So obviously, he had forgotten. But in the meantime, in talking to Reb Mendel, the family had put some food down. And Reb Mendel was feeding this man. And he was so engrossed in the conversation with Reb Mendel that he was eating, and the family were crying as they were watching Reb Mendel feed their father and grandfather. And then Reb Mendel said something which was truly amazing. Like I see this so clearly. I was sitting next to Reb Mendel. Reb Mendel was to my left, and Reb David was to his left. And Reb Mendel was feeding him. And they started speaking about their teacher in Cheder. His name was Rabbi Yisrael. And they started speaking about the Gemara that they were learning, and I remember it was the Gemara in Sanhedrin, which is the Gemara we're learning now in Daf Yomi. It's connected. It was a Gemara in Sanhedrin. And it was deep into the Gemara, about the 60th page of Sanhedrin. Right? And Reb Mendel quoted off by heart a Tosfos in Sanhedrin. And when they started speaking about Sanhedrin, a member of the family brought in a tractate of Sanhedrin. They put it on the table. So I opened it up. They'd mentioned the page number, so I opened it up to the page number. And Reb Mendel started saying the Tosfos off by heart. Reb Mendel wasn't looking into the book, but I could see that he was saying the Tosfos off by heart because I had the book open in front of me. And Reb Mendel was saying and then at one point Reb Mendel stopped, and Reb David continued to say the Tosfos off by heart. It shows you how deep the chinuch, the education was. He forgot to eat. He forgot his own name. He forgot that Nevel was a place of Hasidim. But he didn't forget, word for word, the Tosfos. Outstanding. Anyway, we left Reb David's home, and Reb Mendel, so I asked Reb Mendel, I still don't know what Gemara the Reb Mendel is referring to when he said that there's a Gemara that speaks about even if you're sick yourself, because Reb Mendel wasn't well himself, you still have an obligation to go and visit somebody who's sick. So I said, I don't know, what is that Gemara? So he said, it's the Gemara in Gittin, 7b. I'm like, oh my goodness, of course it is. Where it says, even a poor person who is sustained from charity. So what Reb Mendel wants to say is the poor person could even be a sick person. He's poor in health. He needs charity himself. He needs healing himself. Must also perform charity. If one gives charity to others, the Gemara continues, God will save the person from his own poverty. That's a stunning statement of the Talmud. That means if there's an economic depression, right, if the economy tanks, the reaction that we are supposed to have is not to curtail our giving, because giving is not a luxury. We have to increase our giving. If one gives charity to others, God saves that person from poverty. In other words, when times are tough, giving is not discretionary. It's not like that ticket on Virgin Galactic where you don't have to go to space. Nice, and everyone wants to, but you don't have to. Well, tzedakah is not that. Tzedakah is not discretionary. It's not a luxury that when things are good, that you can partake in it. On the contrary, the Talmud is saying, when you give, and it hurts to give, because you yourself are experiencing lack, that giving is irrational. It's miraculous. You've broken your nature in order to give under those circumstances. God breaks his nature and he performs miracles back to you. In Parshas Re'eh, the Torah tells us that you shouldn't harden your heart. If you see somebody who is suffering a lack of financial means, you mustn't harden your heart. And it goes to quite length. You should lend him sufficient for his needs that is lacking. You should give him, etc. And there's several verses that speak about how you should give to the person. And then it says you should open your hand to him. And a lot of the commentaries are bothered by why it says you should open your hand. It's like, if you're at my table and I ask you to pass the salad, I don't say to you, pass the salad and then open your hand and put it down. You just need to say, pass the salad. Obviously, you open your hand. Huh? Please. Oh, please don't tell my mother I didn't say please. Yeah, you say, please pass the salad, but you don't have to tell the person to open their hand. So why is the Torah saying give money to somebody else and open your hand? The answer is because sometimes we move to give. We hear an inspiring story. We see something that moves us, and we want to give, we want to participate. But between that decision to give and actually, pulling out your credit card and getting it swiped and everything, there's a big distance. And not necessarily just because you resolve to give, will you actually give. So what the Torah is saying is, yes, you've seen somebody who is destitute and you want to help them and you want to give them and you want to make sure that they have, and that's all wonderful. It's a wonderful, but you actually have to open your hand and give it to them. In the end, this is a very practical thing. You have to open your hand and you have to give. And people do give. You know that there's a study, WealthX, they publish a report every year. And in the latest WealthX report, they speak about uber wealthy people. And so the statistics are very interesting. There are 300,000 people in the world who have a net worth that is more than $30 million. So there's 300,000 people that are worth over $30 million. That is 0.0000375% of the world's population. So infinitesimally small bit of the world's population. But they are responsible for 33% of all the giving that's done in the world. All charity comes through that. Now, WealthX doesn't say how many of those 300,000 are Jewish. I would hazard a guess it's probably quite a high number. So this is tzedakah. This is setting things right. You have the money, you can afford to, you have the money, you have $30 million. Most of these people are self-made. They made the money themselves. They do not keep it. They are very charitable. There's an innate understanding that you were given this money to not to keep under your mattress. You don't keep $1 billion under your mattress. You give it to other people. Because nobody could spend $1 billion in 10 lifetimes. Oh, no, that's not true. Kamala Harris did. Okay, but if you're not that, sorry, I couldn't help that. There's an amazing person. His name is Sol Teichmann, Shlomo Zalman Teichmann. And Sol Teichmann was born in 1927. He was born in a place called Munkach, which was a small shtetl, but very large Jewish population. And it was in Hungary. And in the war years, 1944, towards the end of the war, the Germans rounded up over 1 million Hungarian Jews and gassed them and killed them. It was like right towards the end of the war when they got to the Hungarians. And so they basically liquidated Munkach, and they put the entire shtetl into trains, and they sent them to Auschwitz. And Sol Teichmann, at the time, he was born in 1927, so 1944, so he was 17 years old. And he's standing in Auschwitz at the infamous lineup before a man who's sitting going right, left, who he later learned was Mengele Mashtamoy. And he's standing in the line, and he knows every single person in the line. I've got one part of the story, very important. Sol Teichmann is a very wealthy man. He made an absolute fortune. He passed away several years ago, but he made a lot of money, and he was a philanthropist, but he has a very interesting way of giving. And that is, he doesn't give to an institution or a hospital or a school or a university and write them a check and that's the totality of it. No. What he does is he goes around, he does research, and he finds the families, the individual families that are in need. And he goes to them and he gives them money. He finds the Jewish schools that are having trouble that month making payroll. And he goes to the Jewish school and he gives them a check and he helps them make payroll. And so one of his billionaire friends tells him, "So, you don't understand how you're supposed to give. You work hard building your business, running your business. You work hard from the morning till the night, every single day. And then you come home and you give, and then you work just as hard. You have a 9-to-5 job, and then you have a 5-to-9 job, which is finding these people. It's much more efficient to give it over to the pros, give it over to those people who collect money, who head institutions, and they will distribute your money for you, and it will be a lot less work. So why do you do this? Why do you give the money yourself? Why do you do the research yourself? Why do you give individually like you do, when it's so much more hassle and complicated than if you would just write a check?" And this is the story that he told. He said, so in 1944, when he found himself standing in the lineup, ready to come to Mengele, who was going to decide his fate with a flick of his wrist, right? He lived, left, he would go to the gas chambers immediately. And he was standing there and he was looking at the line and he knew every person in that line. Every person in that line on that day that had just got off the trains was a family member, a friend, or somebody that he knew from Munkach. Except one man. One man happened to be standing next to him. He didn't recognize who that man was. He knew that that man was not from Munkach. He knew everybody in Munkach. To him, this stranger. And he said, "You were born in 1925. And Shlomo Zalman Teichmann said, "No, 1927. The man laughed. And he said, "You are confused. All the stress of this horrible journey that you've come on the train, it's made you confused. You think you were born in 1925. You forgot, in 27. You forgot you were born in 25. He said, "No, I was born in 27. He said, No, you're just confused. You're born in 25. I want you to tell me that. Say, I was born in 1925. So partly to humor the guy and just because he had other things on his mind, Teichmann said, "I was born in 1925. He said, "Repeat it." "I was born in 1925. He said, "Say it again." So I was born in 1925. And then the man kind of like disappeared and he went, the line continued, and he came in front of Mengele. And he said to him, Mengele said to him, this monster, he said, "When were you born?" And because the guy had been whispering in his ear all of those, like 1925, like, he just panicked a little bit, like, or whatever, got confused for a second. And he said 1925, because that was it's ringing in his ear. So he said 1925, which of course would make him older than 17, which was his real age, make him older than 18. And so Mengele said, "To life." And so Teichmann told his billionaire friend, he said, "The reason that I give charity individually myself is because an angel stood in line with me in Auschwitz and saved my life. And as soon as I realized that, I resolved that I would be the angel in other people's lives. I would be the angel in other people's lives. So I don't just write a check and leave it at that. I am the angel in other people's lives." So there's a Chabad Shliach in Antwerp who heard this story and wrote it up on a WhatsApp and sent it on a WhatsApp. And the WhatsApp went viral, so one WhatsApp went to another WhatsApp, and you know how these things go. And before long, a lot of people were talking about this story. And the Shliach gets a phone call. Shliach gets a phone call, and they say, it's a lady's voice. She says, "You don't know me." This was in 2021, during COVID. "You don't know me. I am the wife of the late Sol Teichmann. You wrote a story about my husband, and you wrote how he had told a friend of his that he wants to be the angel in somebody's life. My phone, I'm feeling very lonely. I'm isolated from my children. I cannot see them because of COVID. And I lost my husband a year ago, and my heart is broken. And here I am, sitting in my house one day, feeling very, very sad, very down. And a person calls me and said, "Your husband inspired me. Your husband inspired me to be the angel in somebody else's life. So I'm going to be the angel in your life." And she said, the phone hasn't stopped ringing from that first phone call. Person after person is calling me and telling me how they are trying to be the angel in somebody else's life. So I think my message today is that we should be the angels in other people's lives. It is part of bitachon. It is an integral part of bitachon. Bitachon is, as we've learned together in the past few days, bitachon is the feeling that we have everything we need, and we will always have everything we need. But when we give away something, and it is Hanukkah, and Hanukkah is all about the lights, and we are lighting those lights, there's an incredible thing that happens. We take the shamash. We take that shamash who's so selfless. You know, what night was it last night of Hanukkah? Anybody? Number 6, right? How many candles did we light? 7, right? It's 6 nights, the shamash doesn't count. But without the shamash, there'd be nothing. The shamash is the ultimate giving. He gives, and he does not count. He's not one of the famous Hanukkah lights, the 6 lights that we lit last night. He's not one of them. But he brings them all into existence. But here's the incredible thing. And check this out yourself. Try this at home. Tonight, when you take your shamash and you light 7 candles, you will see that as much as the shamash gives life to every single other candle, as much as the shamash brings them to life, brings the light, the fire, the warmth, the energy to each one of the 7 candles tonight, the shamash will not lose anything from its own flame. When you are the angel in someone else's life, you will not lose anything. When you give charity, even to the point where it hurts because you yourself need those resources, you will not lose anything. God says, test me. Test me and you will see that when you give to somebody else, when you help somebody else, when you support somebody else, when you are the angel in somebody else's life, you will see that I will respond in kind. I will respond in kind. You will have more bitachon. You'll have more trust. And that will bring more menuchas hanefesh. It'll bring more tranquility. It'll bring more calm. It will chase away the anxiety. Be the angel in other people's lives and see the miracles that happen in your lives.